Have you ever walked away from a conversation and noticed your mind immediately pressing replay? It's like you go over what you said and how it sounded and what the other person might have meant, or whether you should have handled something differently. And it can be a little frustrating when that voice in the shower just won't turn off. So in this video, we're going to look at what drives this pattern and why your brain holds on to certain moments long after they are over. By the way, I'm Kaylee Larkin, and I help people to rewrite their anxious attachment patterns and attract secure and lasting love. So for people with anxious leaning attachment patterns, this is super common. And it's not because the conversation was dramatic or because you did something wrong. It's because your system, your attachment system, learned to pay very close attention to shifts in connection. So when closeness was very inconsistent earlier in life, then we can become very skilled at reading other people's cues, like their facial expressions or their tone or the timing or little pauses in conversation. Like these little tiny shifts can feel like they matter a lot. And then the mind steps in to try and make sense of them. And once the brain has identified that an event is something to pay attention to, especially if there's emotional content, right? Like if you strongly react to a conversation that you had with somebody, your brain thinks it's more important. And then that replay becomes your mind's way of trying to protect you. So somebody might label this overthinking, but really underneath, this is an attempt to create certainty and to keep you safe. And it's almost like your brain is saying something like, okay, if I can just analyze this enough, maybe I can figure out what they meant. Or if I could just get clarity on this, if I could just understand what they meant by that, maybe next time I won't get blindsided in the same way. Maybe I can prevent this happening in the future, or prevent a future misunderstanding. So in that sense, that loop is a strategy, but it's an old one that's built from a time way back when connection wasn't certain and we had to pay a lot of attention to it, which is what happens with the anxious attachment style. So that replay happens because the anxious attachment style really, really cares deeply about the quality of their interactions. They love that warmth, that closeness, and that emotional clarity. So if something in the conversation feels slightly off, even if it's just like for a little moment, the mind might treat it like it's something that we need to pay attention to. And this doesn't mean that you're being dramatic or just making up problems. This means your system is built around keeping connection. And another reason that this replay can happen is a kind of emotional discomfort. Like if a feeling shows up and it's uncomfortable, disappointment or frustration or embarrassment or, oh my God, shame, concern, the mind often tries to think its way out of that feeling. So rather than us sitting with the emotion and naming it directly, it's returning back to that conversation over and over again, like it's trying to solve a Rubik's Cube. So in a sense, it's like the brain is kind of avoiding discomfort. And over time, this can create a cycle. So there's a moment that happens that feels uncertain. And then the body has a reaction. Maybe it tenses up or someone gets a knot in their stomach. And then the mind starts replaying to try and get control of this whole situation because that physical sensation is uncomfortable. And then that tension or whatever, it's still there. So the mind replays some more. So what's important to understand is that the replay isn't necessarily about the conversation, but rather about the internal response to the conversation. So if we got triggered, if that moment or that interaction like stirred up something that was really old, something about safety or belonging or being understood, these are things that are important to people, right? That mind can go back to look at that scene as if it's trying to figure out the answer from that. When the mind is replaying a conversation for people who lean anxious, it's usually trying to answer questions like, are we okay? Do they still care about me? Did I do something wrong? Or is this going to affect our connection somehow? And so the goal of your mind when it's doing this replaying is to reassure you. Like this is a mental repetition that's helping you to feel better. But the problem is that sometimes that's not what's happening, right? Sometimes we get stuck in these loops and we're like aggravated that now not only did we have a conversation that was unpleasant, but now we're like stuck in a loop around it. So it can also be worth naming that this replay, it can make normal interactions feel more significant than they actually were. So like even a small change in tone might take on a whole life of its own that isn't really too much of a problem, but our brain has magnified it. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes that tone is important, and sometimes we make too much meaning into these little things. So even if the moment was completely neutral, the system might still interpret it as meaningful because of our past wiring. This is not a character flaw. This is just a habit that's built up from years of tracking relationships very closely, tracking that emotional environment and people's body language. Understanding this pattern doesn't stop that replay by itself, but it gives you a different way to relate to it, because then instead of overthinking or feeling like it's too much or you're too much, you can see it like this is your attachment system trying to protect you from uncertainty, trying to keep you safe. That's really beautiful. It learned to keep you safe by staying on high alert, okay? But like the underlying intention was to keep you safe. And when you recognize what your mind is doing, when you can say, oh, this is an old pattern trying to protect connection, the replay starts to lose some of its urgency. It can become something that you notice rather than something that you're like caught up in. So from there, it becomes easier to shift out of that loop, to support your system directly, and then to respond to that event with more clarity and with more equanimity, with more calm. But for right now, the important part is not to understand how to do this. It's to simply understand why. Your mind is not replaying the conversation because you failed or because that moment was really dangerous. Usually that's not the case. It's replaying it because that connection is important to you. And your system learned a long time ago that paying attention was the safest way to hold on to connection. And if you notice this pattern a lot, replaying moments, worrying about how you came across, or feeling unsettled after everyday interactions, sometimes that ties back to boundaries. And I don't mean the kind that you set with other people, but those internal boundaries that help you separate your interpretation from the reality of what happened in the moment. And when those internal boundaries are a little loose, it can be easy for like someone's shift in tone or a brief pause to seem like more of an issue than it is. So clear boundaries help you to hold on to your own perspective and to stay grounded when you're not sure, and then feel less responsible for managing someone else's reactions. So if this is something that you'd like to strengthen, you might like to explore my boundaries course. It's designed to help you understand your limits, to communicate them more confidently, and to build the internal structure that makes those interactions feel safer, easier to navigate. So you don't have to carry every conversation into the shower. You can learn more and get started with the link in the description. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. Drop a comment with what resonated, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. This is Kaylee Larkin, wishing you a beautiful relational journey.